Hey, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door. The honest truth is I have no idea how we're supposed to cover everything that's going on right now and has gone on over the course of the last 24, 40 hours, including news breaking even as we are coming on the show, at least in terms of speculation about what might be happening next. So we'll try to do our part. The players say they want to play college football. Sources close to the Big Ten say they're trying to cancel it. Who ultimately wins this tug of war, and where does the SEC find itself in all of this? We will cover all of it next. Jon Stinchcomb, a very, very important voice on all of this. He'll be with us on the show today there as well. We're glad to have you with us, too. It's DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
For our morning audience watching live on video, we begin with something close to breaking news. Radio podcast folks, you may have heard this by the time you hear our show. The popular radio host Dan Patrick says that his sources tell him that the Big Ten is on the verge of canceling the college football season. That echoes what reports have been over the course of the last 24 hours coming from Sports Illustrated, Yahoo Sports, things like that. He also says the Pac-12 is expected to follow. The veteran college football reporter Matt Hayes, who you may remember from the Sporting News years ago, he's with Bleacher Report now, says that his sources tell him that the college football landscape is shaping up to be a battle between the Pac-12 and Big Ten on one side, the ACC, SEC, and Big 12 on the other. Dan Patrick on his radio show said that currently the Big 12 and the ACC are on the fence about whether or not to cancel the season, and the SEC, according to the words of Dan Patrick, are looking for folks to join them in a season for this upcoming year. This is all a very fast-moving, very complicated story. There is a lot of emotion on both sides of this, or all sides of this. On this program, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, we are not immune. You may have been following the news on this yesterday. As I said before, the initial reports that the Big Ten was expected to move to cancel their season, and the thought among many in the national media that if the Big Ten became a domino that toppled, that would cause all the other conferences to also cancel their season as well. And there was this rise up of various players, the hashtag We Want to Play, making their case for why they thought they were safer. Many players were on campus, why after all the work they put in over the offseason, they felt like they deserved to have a season. All this happened deep into the night. Typically, I go to bed fairly early. I was actually up a little bit late last night, but even after I went to bed, there was more news on this. The We Want to Play movement, which in a lot of ways had been led by Clemson quarterback Trevor Lawrence, arguably the most high-profile figure in college football, and also closely joined on this, he was Justin Fields. And by the way, quick aside, isn't it funny how Fields and Lawrence have always been so closely connected, battling to be the nation's number one player for the class of 2018, battling as arguably the two top quarterbacks in college football right now, maybe one day foes against each other in terms of who'll be drafted the highest, although unseating Lawrence in that respect is probably pretty hard to do. And yet here they are kind of joined together as allies, it would seem, around the idea of hashtag We Want to Play. And I guess there was this, conference call that goes on last night between some of the We Want to Play guys and maybe what you've seen, the We Are United Pac-12 folks. Remember the other day we talked about this, of the Pac-12 players that had a list of demands about what they wanted to see. Some of those reasonable, some of those probably not quite so reasonable. But the various factions of players, the players who seem to like the current system in college football, they just want to be a part of it. The players who seem to want to either make minor alterations to the college football system or drastic changes to the system as it stands right now. Apparently, at least for the moment, they've kind of come together under the same umbrella. There was a graphic that Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, and others shared, and I want to read this to you as a way of kind of setting us up where we need to go today. You see both of the hashtags, the We Want to Play, the We Are United, and then there's a list of beliefs that these united groups seem to have with each other, and there's all five of the Power 5 conferences listed because members from all five of these conferences, including the SEC representative, Alabama running back Najee Harris, were all part of this. I'm going to quickly read this. It says, we want to play football this season, and here's what they also want. To establish universal mandated health and safety procedures and protocols to protect college athletes against COVID-19 among all conferences throughout the NCAA. Give players the opportunity to opt out and respect their decision, guarantee eligibility whether a player chooses to play this season or not, and allow to use our voice to establish open communication and trust between players and officials and ultimately create a college football player association. And this says it was signed by representatives of all the Power 5 conferences. So hopefully you're following this thus far, that the threat of the season being canceled has caused college football players seemingly to unite together for a moment. We don't know how much this group speaks for the full body of college football players overall, but this was a very busy last 24 hours in terms of covering all of this. And I guess here would be my advice as an older guy. I'm 43 now. I'm much older than the players who are kind of trying to navigate this themselves. But here would be my advice. Of the list of things you just saw, most of those things are fairly reasonable. And for the most part, it seems like there's pretty widespread agreement in college football to give, freedom to opt out and potentially, freedom to kind of come back with a frozen year of eligibility in place. It seems like there's fairly widespread support for that. Can I see the graphic one more time, though? Because there's one part of this I think you've got to be really careful about. It's the sentence that says, hey, we want these universal health and safety procedures, and we want them mandated across all conferences around the NCAA. That's where I believe you've got to be really careful if you're Trevor Lawrence, if you're Justin Fields, if you're players in the Georgia roster who want to believe this and want to believe that uniting and banding together is the best way to get what you want. Be really careful when you make the tent so big that it includes the entirety of the NCAA. Because what you see time and time again is when it comes across this entire country in terms of how college football is managed and run, there are some leagues that, frankly, I'm not quite so sure deserve to exist. There are some programs within the Power 5 structure that I'm not quite so sure deserves to exist in terms of their track record of taking care of players, the financial wherewithal to do that more in the future. That if you try to make this about everybody, the more you run the risk of weakening your stance in all of this. Because once you say, hey, all of college football, the various conferences, the various programs, everything under the NCAA umbrella, when you say it's all got to be united together and it's all got to be a part of one coalition, at that point in time, you're only as strong as the weakest link. And in terms of, group of 5, FCS level programs, weak sister programs within the Power 5 structure, there's a lot of weak links there that can drag down all of this. Instead, if you're a player and you want the best possible deal you can get in terms of potentially, being protected from coronavirus right now, or just, better features and benefits for the future, here's what you need to do. You need to allow the conferences themselves to compete for your services. Make them free to do what they want to do. Let them show you who they are, and when they tell you who you are, believe them. And if it's a Big Ten that cares more about PR and more about, university presidents eating M&Ms with a knife and fork, if they care more about that, then let them tell you who they are. And if it's the SEC trying to do right by players, trying to work hard to have a football system, believe them when they tell you that. I ultimately believe, and obviously I've got an agenda here. I don't hide that. I wish more people in the media would be honest about the agenda that they have. But ultimately, I'm a big believer that if you allow the conferences to go about their business free to do what they want to do without having to try to pretend to be united with each other, ultimately it's the competition between the various leagues that provides the best overall opportunity for the players themselves. And I think the players that are trying to unite around the we want to play cause would be better to keep that in mind. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There was a very serious issue that was reported on by Pat Forty, Ross Dellinger at Sports Illustrated about a potential complication that comes on the heels of potentially having the coronavirus. It's a heart condition. I had never heard of it. It is extraordinarily rare. However, the rarity of these situations doesn't stop people from, sometimes panicking about stuff like this. But either way, according to the reporting from Forty and Dellinger, this has become a very serious issue. In fact, let me read a sentence here. It's myocarditis, I believe is how you say it. And what Dellinger and Forty have written at Sports Illustrated is that fear over myocarditis, which is kind of like a heart condition that can I guess basically be like an offshoot of a virus, right? You have a virus, and more than just the coronavirus, but a lot of viruses, you have a virus, and this heart condition can pop up after that. What Dellinger and Forty write is that fear over myocarditis, which is the heart condition in particular we're talking about here, has reached the top level of the sport, with Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby and Big 10 Commissioner Kevin Warren having both privately expressed serious concern over this condition. Once again, that's Ross Dellinger, Pat Forty from Sports Illustrated. So you have reporters saying, hey, what about this heart condition we've heard about, this potential, cardiac issue that you can have on the heels of having a virus like the coronavirus. And all of a sudden, the leagues are saying, well, that's a reason to shut down the sport. This is, it may be rare, but it's still scary. We can't have the sport. However, look at what's going on in the SEC on issues just like this. Let me point to you to an Alabama not strength and conditioning coach. He's actually the sports scientist, but he was hired at the same time the new strength and conditioning coach was hired at Alabama. On the heels of seeing this from Sports Illustrated, here's what he tweeted about myocarditis. This is Matt Ray. This is the director of sports science at the University of Alabama. He writes on Twitter that one thing that really irritates me about COVID paranoia is the apparent thought that we know nothing about how the body responds to viruses. We do. And there's a lot of people much smarter than me working in this area. Ray from Alabama goes on to say, now all of a sudden myocarditis, that's the heart condition I told you about before, Ray says, now all of a sudden myocarditis is a, quote, unknown possibility. Ray says, I alluded to this in a paper I published back in 2009 about sudden cardiac death among athletes. It happens after most infections. Now, Ray would later tweet that he didn't mean most infections. He said it's possible after most infections. He clarified his stance on that. But he goes on this tweet to say, we watch for warning signs all the time. Screening now is very good. Nothing new here when it comes to that. I think what Matt Ray from the University of Alabama is pointing out here is the overall strength that the SEC kind of already has in place. Myocarditis, as scary as it sounds, may be a new thing to me. It may be a new thing to reporters reporting on this topic. But for the sports scientists and the athletic trainers and the folks like that who are working to keep SEC athletes safe and keep them in the best possible health condition they can be in, you hear from a guy right there that says, this condition is nothing new for me. I've been watching for an athlete since 2009. It's another example of why the SEC, with its financial resources, I believe, is in a better position to take care of players than a lot of the other leagues in college football would be. And the more that you ask the NCAA to kind of unite together, the various conferences to start uniting and working together, the less room I believe that you give for conferences like the SEC that would want to lead the way to actually be able to do that. And by the way, speaking of leading the way on this topic, we saw Hunter Yurchik, the Arkansas athletic director, who's kind of already spoken out on this too. You know, he certainly wants to be a part of this. He writes, on behalf of the Razorback football team, that includes my son, and each of the Arkansas Razorback student athletes that I represent, serve, support, and care for, fight, and love, he says, hashtag we want to play. Have you seen Big Ten athletic directors stepping up to say that? Have you seen Big Ten university presidents stepping up to say that? Are they covering their own backs? Are they covering something else maybe? Or are they stepping up in support of what their players want and explaining the ways in which the Alabama sports scientist did in terms of how the SEC is looking to get that done? I trust the SEC on this, and it's not because I want football at all costs. No one wants football at the expense of the health and safety of a player who plays the sport. But when smart people associated with this league say they can get the job done, I believe them, and I think the players should as well. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and we're glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, or as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. None of this would be possible without our friends from Pella Window and Door, by the way. They equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. That means curb appeal improved. Could lead to higher resale value when you go to sell your home. That means energy, especially this time of year when air conditionings are working overdrive, you keep that inside the house. It looks good. It functions well. It's all part of what Pella Window and Door of Georgia can do for you. They've got lots of consultation options for those of you that want the video teleconference. You don't want a whole lot of in-person stuff right now. Pella can take really good care of you on that, explain all the installation options that you have available to you, and talk about a plan that makes sense for your home. They've also got a great deal right now as well. Between now and August 20th, you can get 10% off your qualifying project, or actually, this is not an or, this is an and. An and 0% APR for 36 months. Great deal from Pella Window and Door of Georgia. A couple ways to get in touch. Online, PellaBranch.com. That website, once again, PellaBranch.com. Or you can give them a call in their Dunwoody showroom at 404-445-2979. That's 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. All right, we're going to get Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in just a moment. Before that, let me go around the doghouse, assisted today by AAA. I want to keep the same theme going for a moment. Yes, the SEC makes, money hand over fist. Yes, it is motivated to have a season. But those financial resources, that motivation, I think actually exists to serve players. Doing right by players is what the SEC is incentivized to do, because if you stop doing that, then the spigot of money will get turned off, and your stature within the sport is going to be diminished. The SEC, as many coaches have said, they want the responsibility of taking care of these players, and many players over the course of the last 24 hours have spoken up to say that we feel well taken care of within the SEC. With that in mind, I thought Ron Corson, UGA's athletic trainer, who spoke to reporters at the end of last week, had a very good message on that same topic. And, in a world we live in, which, cynicism is just kind of the order of the day, I think it's easy to want to disregard messages like this. I think it's easy to want to not believe these kinds of things when they are said. But Corson, in the midst of talking about how Georgia's working to take care of its players, emphasized the word care in that formula. It's not about just the procedures you have in place and sort of the bureaucratic technicalities of all of this. It's also about the emotion and the natural concern that a human being typically has for another. Let me read this to you. You can read the entirety of Corson's press conference at DawgNation.com, but this sentence in particular stood out to me. UGA's Director of Sports Medicine, Ron Corson, says, "We have a philosophy here that people will know how much you care before they care how much you know," and you've probably heard that before. Corson goes on to say, "What I mean by that is you might be the best clinician in the world, but if the kids don't think you care about having their best interest at heart," and I think our kids believe that, our coaches, every time we have a meeting, every time we've had a practice, Corson goes on to say about this that, do we have the rest of the Corson quote here? Maybe not. But he basically goes on to say, he says, every time we have a meeting, every time we have a practice with us and our strength coaches, we try to emphasize something about risk mitigation. And I think that's one of the reasons we've been effective. And again, our kids have bought into it. So what Ron Corson says there is the belief that what has helped Georgia take good care of kids during the coronavirus is the belief that Georgia players have that they are well taken care of by the Georgia coaches, and the Georgia coaches care about them. We've seen a couple of player parents who've kind of weighed on this topic. Chris Milton, the father of Kendall Milton, said that he had an opportunity to think, and he says, "I think my son is safer in a structured and safe environment of a football system with protocols in place rather than walking and roaming freely through the rest of the student body. Plus, some of these athletes are safer at school than home." That's Chris Milton, who weighed in on that topic. The father of Tate Ratledge has also weighed in kind of a similar vein, says, in thought and mind of the hashtag we want to play. Dean Ratledge, the father of Tate Ratledge, says hashtag parents want them to play. He says, "I support we want to play. I can think of no safer place for my son to be than at UGA in the care of Ron Corson, who you just heard from, and the coaching staff. Those guys care about our kids. Let's go." This is what the parents of Georgia players are saying about the situation that's in place in UGA. Now, do different parents and different players feel differently? There's a very good chance that's probably true. However, I think it's important to look at the preponderance of evidence for people who are arguing for the chance to go out and play, and the responsibility that the SEC is looking to take to make sure that they are as safe as they can possibly be. No one can completely mitigate against all risk, but the SEC is volunteering for this responsibility, and regardless of what the Big Ten decides to do, regardless of what the Pac-12 decides to do, I support the SEC as it tries to move forward here, and I hope they get a chance to go out there and get that done. It's Around the Doghouse. It's assisted today by our friends at AAA. And, I've been a big believer in AAA for a long time. They just find a way to make the driving experience better, to keep you safer on the roads, but they also take good care of their members there as well, including the AAA Savings Hack Pack. This is a really good thing to be aware of because it's a combination of benefits that are worth more than $1,000. It has free career assistance, identity theft protection, up to 85% off prescriptions, and also discounts on food and essentials. This is a great thing for you to be a part of. It's part of every annual membership when it comes to AAA, just like the legendary roadside assistance. So please go to this website. It's AAA.com/go savings. That's AAA.com/go savings. And you can discover just how easily a AAA membership can pay for itself. So make sure you check that out. I'm running a little late here, but I want to get to Jon Stinchcomb. He's got some big stuff to say. So let's do that. And we'll continue to follow all this news as college football fights for its right to play here in a very, very pivotal week for the sport. It's a Marlow's Tavern Insider Update with Jon Stinchcomb.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
I've always respected Jon Stinchcomb's voice, not just because he's a friend and a former UGA great, but also because he's a guy that's always brought a level-headed approach to this. He's a big stakeholder in the University of Georgia. He's still involved in the operations of the athletic department. He weighs in, on those topics, and to hear him on this is an incredible asset for us here during our Marlow's Tavern Insider Update. Jon, I appreciate you being here as a part of the program. I'm a big believer that the SEC deserves a chance to play this fall. I trust this league to get it right as much as anyone can in the face of a global pandemic that we still know very little about. Maybe you've seen some of the ways in which players and folks around college football have spoken out in the last 24 to 48 hours. Where's your thought process on all of this at the moment?
Well, I think it reflects the overall feel that we get across this country, and that there's a wide variety of opinions and concerns that are individualized. I think we all have our own perspectives, and that's definitely ringing true in the realm of college football, because there are some that have expressed their deep concern about safety, and others are chomping at the bit to get back out on the field. And I think you're trying to find a balance of how do we do that safely? How can we get folks out on the field? Because there is a mass majority of players, I would say even the ones that are concerned, that love the game. They just want to do so in a way that doesn't put them at a risk that they're no longer comfortable taking.
So I've been very clear about my perspective on all of this. I'm a big believer in the current college football system. I think it does right by players far more than it does wrong. And I'm also a very big believer that the season, as I said before, deserves a chance to take place this upcoming year if it can all possibly be had. And for some people who hear that, John, the response is going to be, well, that means you want football at all costs. That means that you're not paying attention to the very real risks of the disease, the very, real, even if they are rare, potential side effects that players could experience by going out and playing. And my response back to that would be, and this is what I want to hear you weigh in on, is that I believe that leagues like the SEC are incentivized to do right by their players. In other words, if you said as a SEC athletic director, as a conference president, or I should say conference commissioner, university president, things like that, that, hey, no matter what the scientific data is telling us, we need to go out there and have a season. Well, you wouldn't be a president very long. You wouldn't be a conference commissioner very long. You wouldn't be an athletic director very long. You wouldn't be a head coach very long if you disregarded the best way to care for players to kind of go out and sort of shoehorn a season into kind of a difficult set of circumstances. That doing right by players, we've heard from Ron Corson on today's show, the way in which Georgia's trying to do that. We've heard from an Alabama sports scientist in terms of what the Crimson Tide might be trying to do that doing right by players is actually fairly well financially incentivized because the big flow of money runs out once parents no longer trust you anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a real disservice to so many of these discussions when we boil them down as binary. It's not all or nothing. It's not we have nothing or we go back to the way things were. I don't think that's even in discussion. So when folks form and articulate their arguments to say, you're putting us at the same risk in spite of this pandemic, I don't think anyone is making that argument. So I really struggle with those that reduce their case back to, we're going back to status quo, and that's putting us all at this increased risk because of the pandemic. Nobody is making that case. There's so much more nuance to each side of the argument, really, and I think it shouldn't be lost that yes, there is considerable amount of finances involved, and there is motivation to keep athletic programs afloat. That shouldn't be minimized. I think there's a legitimate case for that. I think when we brush that under the rug and say, you're willing to put players at risk just because there's finances involved, I think that's a gross misinterpretation of those that are recognizing without college football, there's a number of programs across the country that will not survive. And I'm not talking about just their college football teams. I'm talking about athletic programs. So, yes, as we try to wade through these waters, there is so much more that goes into these discussions because we're thinking about student athletes not only in 2020 but 2021 that may not have an opportunity to get a college education if we don't have an athletic program that survives through this pandemic. So there's so much more to these cases than just, the NCAA is greedy or the SEC is greedy and they know how much money is involved. This money goes to provide for a number of high school students that are leaving their high schools an opportunity to go to college. And, I can't emphasize the importance of making sure that's still an opportunity long past the days where we're having this very discussion about the pandemic.
Let me do one more on this topic, then I want to move on and talk about some different stuff with you. I want to bring in a subject that I think you and I may have a little bit of disagreement on, or maybe I may find out that's different. You know, when you're an elite athlete, there's always going to be people trying to exploit you, and I'm probably not immune to that. You know, when some of the players last night were tweeting out the hashtag we want to play and getting that message going, someone like me that wants to see college football stay more the same in the future as opposed to greatly altered the way that some, you know, voices seem to want to make that change. I have a temptation, and frankly, more than a temptation, I do try to use those arguments from last night as proof that players, for the most part, are happy with the current agreement they have by and large, and the activist voices about unionizing and things like that are really just more on the fringe. I'm a big believer that too much change for college football runs the risk of destroying something that has been very beneficial for the lives of many, many people. And admittedly, the hashtag we want to play becomes a little bit of a cudgel I can use to try to make my case there on that. It seems almost impossible, Jon, to separate the degree to which college football players are truly amateurs in terms of how do you go out and have a season this year. At least there are certain people who want to make those two ideas coupled together. What do you kind of come down on all of this in terms of the concerns that players have about playing or not is also a part of a larger conversation about what their status is as amateur athletes?
Oh, it's a mess. It's become a hot mess just because I think it highlights the challenges and benefits that college athletics, specifically profitable ones, we're talking about college football here, and the role and partnership that they have with their universities. So yes, we're talking, that's $1 billion industry per year, and there is significant amount of money that is being exchanged that probably wasn't nearly as close as what it was in the 80s or long before then. So people look at that and say, well, it's abuse of players and there's missed opportunity. And I think if you start peeling back the layers, it only gets smellier because there's so much that goes into it, and the benefits that players receive and what the university is making in money. That yes, it's convoluted, and I think you're right. I think a number of college players, they just want to play. We want to play. I get that. But the message has been heard from the likes of Leonard Fournette and Nick Bosa, and even closer to home, you look at Georgia players. There's a number that decided to forego an opportunity to be with their team despite a commitment of once you start with your team, it used to be an unstated rule that you finish, and that's no longer been the case. Bowl games really sticked out in mind that there was players that opted out that said, I have used this vehicle of playing for the University of Georgia, and it has provided an opportunity for me, and I no longer need that, and I'm going to end our relationship, break that contract at this point. So the message is growing louder that there's a contingency of players that have used college football as a vehicle to get to the NFL. That is not new. I think the method in which they are utilizing that vehicle has most certainly changed.
It's our Marlow's Tavern Insider Update with Jon Stinchcomb. The Marlow's Tavern there in your neighborhood is back open again. You can still get to-go food if you want that, but you can also eat right there in the dining room. And the best way to find out about all the things happening, the tavern in your neighborhood, is the brand new Marlow's Tavern app. Special offers available right there through the app. Also rewards when you stop by and see the tavern in your neighborhood. You get those by using the Marlow's Tavern app there as well. It's a really fun way to stay connected to Marlow's Tavern and take advantage of all the things that Marlow's offers for its best customers, those that have the Marlow's Tavern app. So make sure you download that, get your special offers, earn your rewards points, and enjoy some chef-inspired food. The house-made magic that Marlow's Tavern has been famous for a long time. You can get that at your local tavern right there in your neighborhood. The best way to stay close to it all and get access to it all is by downloading the brand new Marlow's Tavern app. Jon, it seems really weird that on Friday we found out that Georgia was going to play 2 additional games that we're only just now hearing about, and yet it's almost like there's not even room to talk about that subject on today's show. That's how busy and newsy it is. But Georgia did add games with Arkansas and Mississippi State, assuming the season takes place. That's the attempt anyway. And there was a lot of controversy around, which teams were hit the hardest. Obviously, Missouri and Arkansas seemed to take the brunt of that. Alabama's additional games were arguably a little easier than some fans kind of hoped that they would be. How did you think of the overall manner in which the SEC handled this? It's obviously a trying time for everybody. And how did you think Georgia shook out in all of this?
Well, the first thing that stood out to me was Coach Pittman. I mean, if you're in Arkansas and you look at 6 of your 10 games are against top 13 teams, that makes for a rough opening start as a rookie head coach. So I'm glad I'm not a Razorback this time of year. It's going to be a rough year, even if we do play ball, if you're over there in hog country. So I'm grateful to not be an Arkansas Razorback. Now, for University of Georgia, I thought it worked out about as well as you could ask. The 2 additional teams seem like some of the more favorable matchups for Georgia. I know there's plenty of Dog fans that were hoping that Alabama would have a tougher slate, but you know what? I think what the SEC did, I don't know how they ended up making those decisions, but to me, it certainly comes across as a way of making sure their top 4 teams are well represented at the end of the year if there is some national opportunities and postseason play, which, who knows? There's so much still left up in the air, but I can appreciate the way they made their decisions, and it looks like Georgia certainly didn't make out with the short end of the stick after the remaining schedule came out.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just follow up on that real quick to say that you have to look at the totality of the deal here. And while a lot of UGA fans, other SEC fans, were upset about Alabama, I think adding the games that it added to go along with the schedule that already plays, an SEC West full slate, along with Georgia and Tennessee out of the SEC East, to add a game with Florida there might have seemed like a little bit of an imbalance. I actually don't mind Alabama necessarily feeling that way. I felt like for, Florida and Georgia, the 2 teams that would seem to be competing at the top of the SEC East, the more you can make those schedules consistent, I think the fairer that works out. Florida adding a game against Texas A&M, knowing that Georgia already had Auburn and Alabama, that seems about right. Florida's got, preseason, number 5, number 13. Georgia has preseason number 3, number 11. When you think about, Alabama and Auburn on the Georgia schedule, Texas A&M and LSU on the Florida schedule, that seems to work out about right. Tennessee, I guess, is going to feel like they got dumped some extra games on them. But the truth is, Tennessee's not a legitimate division contender in my mind anyway. So,
yep.
I think that doing right by the top 4 teams, at least in what appears to be the top 4 teams, in a situation where there was never going to be a perfect scenario here, I think the SEC came pretty close to getting that right, and I obviously know that there's probably a little bit of bias built into that because Georgia got handed 2 games that it's expected to be big favorites in.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think if you're talking about this as a conference decision, what's best for the conference, who do you think they should look out for? How do you think it should be fair? If you're going to bias it in any way, I think you're having the conference, it's their well-being that you're trying to place at paramount, and I think they did an admirable job, and it's all difficult, all these decisions. You're going to tick off somebody no matter what. I think that's what they were trying to balance when they're making these decisions, and we didn't end up on the short end of the stick, so I'm happy with it. I know there's other teams that probably don't feel that same way, but you're never going to please everybody. I think that's apparent in every situation that we've seen right now.
Yeah,
so
no doubt.
You do the best you can, you make a decision, you keep moving, and you have a reason to justify it, and understand that there's still going to be some upset folks when you do.
Let me finish on this note. We have seen a lot of people speak up over the course of the last 24, 48 hours after the Colorado and a news site in the state of Colorado came out with a report about Colorado State, and Mike Bobo, the former Georgia offensive coordinator, former Georgia quarterback, was kind of mixed up in some of that kind of stuff. Obviously, neither one of us is going to say, with expertise, what may or may not have happened in Fort Collins. Neither one of us were there. But your brother Matt has spoken up in defense of Mike Bobo, his character. We've seen DJ Shockley, Mark Richt. A lot of folks kind of associated with Bobo. A lot of high school coaches have kind of spoken up. Bobo was a very young coach and really just kind of moving into that phase of his life when you were at UGA. How well do you know Mike Bobo? And I guess what would you say about him in a time in which a lot of folks seem to want to speak up in his defense at the moment?
Well, I don't know him that well. I know him, and I've been around him, and I know his personality, but I'm not going to claim to be a Mike Bobo expert. But I do put weight in those that have spoken up to his defense. I think with DJ speaking up, I look to the number of players from Colorado State, specifically the black players, that have not voiced complaints. And some have been the first to say, you know what, he's never said anything that I found offensive. And I've read through the articles. Anytime you're talking about a Georgia man, I'm going to try to stay up to date on that information. But the players that have come to his defense, and even some of the other coaches that say, you know what, I work with the man on a daily basis, year-round, and I can't think of anything that sticks out in my mind as crossing a line. Is he sarcastic? You better believe it. And if we're in a world where some things that are said in a locker room are brought to light, some of it is going to be offensive. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about racially discriminatory language. That there's no place for it.
Sure.
Make no mistake, I'm not defending anyone who's saying disparaging things of anyone because of their race. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying in a locker room, you have to have some thick skin, and there is a line that should never be crossed, and we all recognize now especially that you can't say things that are demeaning towards a person's race or devalue them as a person because of their skin color. And I've yet to see or read where Mike Bobo has done that. And I'm going to reserve the right to really form my opinion on the whole situation until all the chips are on the table. But from what I've read right now, with the players, especially that played under him, coming to his defense, I don't see much of a case as to where Mike Bobo is a raging racist that has devalued people because of their race.
Well, John, you're always such a measured and calm voice, and I really appreciate that. You're just a great guy to talk about, whether it be the action on the field or these days it seems like a lot more action, unfortunately, we would like off the field. You're just very plugged in, very clued into it all, and we really appreciate that. Thanks for being here as part of our Marlow's Tavern Insider Update, and I look forward to hopefully getting a chance to talk about some actual real games here at some point in time in the future.
I can't wait for that. We're talking about football instead of everything that's circling around it. Those will be pleasant days for all of us. And until then, go Dogs.
Good stuff, John.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, you got to have voices like John on the show. I mean, the one thing that I hope that you respect from me is that, I don't try to be anything other than what I am. I do wear my emotions on my sleeve. I am opinionated. I am going to shoot from the hip on stuff like this. I'm not that worried about being calm and measured. That's just not really something I'm, all that interested in. However, every meal can't also be, hot sauce either. You got to have a little bit of, something else kind of mixed in from time to time. And I think that John is good at that because he played the game at a very high level. He has, friends who are part of this sport, both as a player and a coach. He's part of the athletic board at Georgia. This is a guy who is still very plugged in and made, calm, distinguished demeanor part of his calling card. And so I think it's important to have that on the show here. I want to have more on some of the battle to have a season before we're done here. Let me, as part of the SEC, we're going to do some different stuff, and I'll get into the Mike Bobo thing in a moment. Before that, though, as far as the new SEC schedule goes, I do think the league kind of got this right. And, by the way, I am not necessarily a Johnny-come-lately on this in terms of, I was always of the belief that, adding too many tough games to one contender schedule was always going to be something that I could understand a team wanting to argue against. I even said about Florida. Now, as a fan, when I've been very entertained, had Florida gotten LSU and A&M, which was initially rumored might be the case, of course I would have been entertained by that. And, of course, I would have lapped up to Gator tears much the same way many of you would have. But ultimately what happened, giving Florida, Texas A&M to go along with LSU, matching up for Georgia, which has Auburn and Alabama coming out of the SEC West, that seems somewhat fair. Knowing that Alabama already had Georgia on its schedule, and to a certain extent Tennessee, which was, I guess the first team outside the top 25 of the coaches poll in terms of the also receiving votes category. Frankly, Alabama's schedule was already pretty full there as well. Maybe they deserved a break. There are programs that feel like they got dumped on a little more than they should have. Tennessee's schedule, no doubt, got tougher on all of this. However, I have said very clearly for a while that I didn't think that Tennessee was a top 25 team anyway. Going to fight to have a winning record based on the 12-game schedule I thought it was going to be playing. Tennessee fans would say we'd love a chance to have, to prove that on the field. But in a year where someone's going to be the sacrificial lamb of the upper-tier teams in the SEC, I don't have a problem being the Vols, because I don't think the Vols were a real contender anyway. And that's even more true when you bring in the teams that got just hammered the worst, teams like Arkansas and Missouri. I made this case when we did our Cover 4 Live, brought to you by Georgia Farm Bureau, our special edition of that on Friday. If you had to give somebody the worst schedule, Eli Drinkwitz, Missouri, I won't even say much about, but if you had to give somebody the worst schedule, giving that to Arkansas is really not a bad idea. Sam Pittman's a first-year coach. He is beloved in Fayetteville. He's going to have a long honeymoon. And frankly, if you gave him easier SEC games, Arkansas doesn't have the talent to win those anyway. So why not play the absolute toughest schedule you can? Hunter Yurchek, the Arkansas athletic director, says the toughest schedule of all time. It may very well be. Sam Pittman's clock in terms of building Arkansas into a winner doesn't start until the following year anyway. So if you had to dump some tough games on somebody, getting Georgia added, getting Florida added, Arkansas seems a pretty good candidate for that. Yes, those considerations were probably made. I think it's easier to give a team like Arkansas tougher games right now because Hog fans are just going to be more patient. So I think all of that actually probably worked out pretty well. You heard Jon Stinchcomb talking about Mike Bobo before. This obviously a situation that does not seem to be working out pretty well. Colorado would report, I think that's how you say it, from what went on at Fort Collins with the current coach Steve Addazio, what may have happened during the Mike Bobo era, what happened with the basketball regime led by Larry Eustachiou, who's had his problems at a number of different stops over the years. And, ultimately, way before people stepped up and started defending Mike Bobo, DJ Shockley, Matt Stinchcomb, Mark Richt, a ton of others. Joe Cox, who was a Bobo staffer now with him at South Carolina, was actually a part of some of the allegations against Bobo. I already had my problems with this piece because of how non-specific it was. There's a lot of descriptive language about how it felt to work around Bobo, but very little in the way of specifics about what Bobo allegedly did wrong. As far as the few criticisms that were in there, I can't speak to what actually went down in Fort Collins. I wasn't there. But when you look at the overall dysfunction displayed by the entire ordeal here, disgruntled former player, disgruntled former staffer, crazy situation involving a basketball program with a coach that probably should not have ever been hired in that job, just given some of the problems he's had before, my advice to people like Mike Bobo is, if you get offered a job at a place like Colorado State, do not go. These backwater college football programs are just not capable of playing the game at the highest level and doing right. I mean, when a guy like Bobo leaves Georgia to go to Colorado State, he's validating that program. He's giving that program some credibility otherwise wouldn't have had. And frankly, had Georgia paid Bobo the money he was worth as an offensive coordinator, maybe he never would have had to endure this chapter of his life. But we're in a day and age now where, look at the money that young defensive coordinator Dan Lanning is making, more than $1 million at Georgia now. Look at the raise that Steve Sarkisian just got. I believe he's now north of $2 million in terms of the money he's making. We're in a day and age now where you can make as much money as a big-time coordinator as you can as a small-time head coach. And when small-time head coach means you have to go work at small-time program, my advice would be don't do it. Don't go there. Don't be a part of that because when you go there, you are in a roundabout way responsible for every single thing that's going on with those programs. And right now, that's not quite so sure. That's something I think you want to necessarily be a part of. Steer clear of programs like this in the future. And frankly, for programs like Colorado State, especially in this conversation we currently have about who can afford to play college football, who can't, who can afford to take care of college football players and who can't. I think programs like Colorado State that can't even keep their names out of the headlines and, local newspapers, I think they should have to step up and validate why it is they deserve to exist. Because if the kinds of crazy infighting is going on the way it was described in local media reports, then not only would people not even notice if Colorado State football went away, its actual disappearance might be a good thing. By the way, leave it to Florida to finally get a 5-star commit. Jason Marshall, a cornerback from down in South Florida, committed to the Gators over the weekend. And that news essentially got no attention whatsoever because of #WeWantToPlay and everything else that's happened. I mean, admittedly, this is a recruiting win for Florida, something they haven't gotten a lot of as of late. And I'm sure Gators fans will be touting this. But the good PR that typically comes from a 5-star commit, Florida gets none of that over the course of the weekend because the news was all pointed to whether or not we're going to even have a season. I guess I will just also say this. As per usual, when it comes to highly rated Florida commits, I can't wait till the eventual top 5 that I'm sure that Marshall will be sending out sometime this fall before he, ultimately makes his final college decision, because you kind of know that is coming, and we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, I want to kind of bring everything back to kind of where we were at the beginning. The battle that's ongoing about whether or not we get to have a college football season, and the supposed lines that have been drawn between what the SEC might want to do. I believe this league wants to play, and I believe it deserves a chance to go out and get that done, whether the Big Ten decides they don't want to or not, and the rumors are they don't. Pac-12 may join them. ACC, Big 12, we may find out about them at some point in time. And by the way, there's also a chance that if the powers that be get their way, the situation may become just too untenable for the SEC to even try to go out and do what it wants to do as well. I certainly grant that is a possibility, but I believe this league is going to try to fight for what it can. I think the stakes are really high here. I really do, because I think the future of college football in many ways is at stake. Said before, I am very open about my agenda. I want college football to stay the same, more so than not, in the future. I'm respectful of players who have some things they like to see be different. I'm not saying I'm against all of that, but the radical activist voices within the sport right now that seem to want to push this sport in an entirely different direction, I think ultimately that's bad for college football. And it's not the only thing that college football is battling right now. But there was a very interesting report that's going to come out in the last little bit. Pete DeMel, who writes for Yahoo Sports on Twitter, he writes for Yahoo Sports. He put this on Twitter, that the NFL is still looking at the possibility of moving moving some of its games to Saturday if there's no college football this fall. This kind of ties back into something that Mike Florio, who knows the league very well, writes for Pro Football Talk. He owns Pro Football Talk, has written in the past that the NFL might look to make the Saturday games kind of a pay-per-view type thing, that the Sunday TV package would remain what it was. Maybe you can't get more money out of the networks in terms of what they've already chosen to spend, but you can move a couple of other games. You can make them on-demand viewing, charge people money for it. It becomes an additional revenue source for the NFL to make up some of the ground that it might lose because of the absence of fans this year, and it becomes just another television product. It's games on Saturday all fall long. Pete DeMel says, yes, the NFL is looking at doing that. If you don't believe that's an encroachment on college football, ground that the sport could lose that'll never get back again, I think you're fully kidding yourself if you don't view that as a huge possibility. When you couple that with the fact that in the midst of all the talk of canceling college football, no one's actually talking about canceling college, at least for the most part. Most of the Big Ten schools, I think Minnesota may be one of the exceptions, they're still planning on having in-person instruction in college this fall. When there's so little scrutiny about college coming back, and yet all this maximum scrutiny about college football coming back, when the NFL is standing perched, ready to take over the TV window that has long belonged to college football on Saturdays, boy, I think it's easy for a lot of people to feel like this entire conversation has been rigged, and that certain people just seem to want to try to put the future college football in jeopardy. The sport's got to fight back if it wants to save itself. We may be in the midst of seeing that right now. All right, so let's get ready to wrap up here today. And, DawgNation.com is still going to be a great place to go to keep up with all of this. And we have big events, by the way, on both Tuesday and Wednesday. Maybe a little bit left in terms of tickets to be a part of our Inside the Huddle event for Wednesday. That's August 12th, 7 p.m., $10 on that. Maybe a spot or two left for you to be a part of that. So please make sure you check that out, DawgNation.com. We're completely sold out on Tuesday. We're about to be sold out on Wednesday. Myself, Mike Griffith, kind of dealing with all of the events of the days, inside information on kind of how that's going to go, and just kind of a free-flowing conversation where you'll have your voice heard, your questions answered. We'll do everything we can to cover that with you Tuesday and Wednesday. Go to DawgNation.com for more details on that. Let me also give you a Gator Hater Updater. Good news on that front. Been a while since those lousy, stinking Gators beat the Georgia Bulldogs. About 1,381 days. Love to end the show on that note. It's DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll see you tomorrow. All right. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. R.S. Andrews can be trusted to do all of that for you. Your air conditioning goes out. In many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you. Can always replace it for you, but they can also get your system back to factory fresh specs and prevent that from even happening, which is a great thing. It may only cost you $99. So good stuff there on that front. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. All right, let me go to Facebook first. We're going to get as many comments as we can. Your thoughts about everything going on with the fight to have a college football season and the voices that want to step up and defend this sport. I think it's an exciting time, but an important time there as well. So let's get your comments, and we'll kind of roll through all of this. Anikin Tuin, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, says, are you against a players union? By and large, I am against that. I don't mind telling you that. That doesn't mean that I'm against every single wish that a lot of players might have for how their college experience could be better. I'd love to find a way to support that as much as I possibly could, to the extent that I would have the power to do that. I'm saying theoretically here. But in terms of the way in which some people seem to actively be pushing for a unionization of college football players, by and large, I don't think that'd be a good thing. And I hope you, even if you disagree with that, I hope you at least respect the fact that I am willing to be open with you about my feelings on that. And I'm respectful of you if you do disagree. Matt Rukavina says that college football will probably never be the same after this. It may not be. May not be. Antoine Middleton says, if the parents are okay with their kids taking these risks, then the NCAA should go with it, paid or not. And that's, I guess, pretty similar to what my opinion is that I think there's an assumption that, I think it's an incorrect assumption that the large majority of players, at least based on what we're hearing right now, and their families are somehow skeptical of the college football system that is in place. We've seen the Ohio State parents speak out in a big way on this. We've seen other voices around the Georgia program speak out in a big way on this. I think most families believe in their school. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent their kid to that school anyway. Joe Moody says, isn't honest ironic that Franks now plays for the Hogs? That is kind of funny. Shelton Tucker says he thinks that Nick Saban got the best deal when it comes to schedule. Yeah, but you got to acknowledge that Georgia got itself a pretty good deal out of all that too. I mean, you do. Matthew Dill says if football is only profitable for the Power Five, then so be it, in my opinion. Get creative for the parts of the country that want to give a shot and do temporary conference realignment if necessary. Yeah, I mean, is there the possibility that, some schools from other conferences could still try to play even if their conference doesn't want to? It's a little harder to do because you're talking about, having to rebuild schedules completely. Plus, there's just, like, we don't talk politics on this show, but there's obviously some political considerations to some of this kind of stuff too that, is just a factor whether, we want to, fully dive into all of that or not. That kind of makes it a bit of a challenge. But the more conferences themselves can kind of work together, because it's much easier to work together with your own conference mate. The more conferences themselves can work together, I think the better, the best it is overall. When conferences compete against each other, players win. When the SEC works to give itself as many advantages and make itself as attractive to players as it can possibly be, that's how I believe the players ultimately win. The more it becomes this NCAA thing where everybody has to do it together, the more I think the players end up getting, shoddy health and safety measures, meager benefits. You let these leagues start competing against each other and see who wants to serve players the best. I mean, it's, the same thing. You live on a street with one restaurant or live on a street with 9 restaurants. If it's one restaurant, then cold food, bad service, very little punishment for not taking good care of you. If it's 9 restaurants, then the worst restaurant's going out of business. And that just makes the situation better for everybody. Chris Branham says, if you had these schools that wanted to band together and play independently, the liability in that situation would make even the most ruthless lawyer blush. Yeah, I mean, obviously liability is a part of this. J.C. Cole says they canceling the season. I knew it was coming. And you know what? That may be the end result of all of this. We may be on this show one day talking about the season being canceled. But what you've seen over the last 24 hours, the player level, the athletic director level, I think the president of Wake Forest University has stepped up on this. Various forces within the sport are not going to give up without a fight. Should they have been fighting for the sport sooner? They absolutely should have been. The key leadership in the sport was way too passive for way too long. Scared to step up and defend its model. Scared to step up and defend itself as something that deserved to exist. They should have been doing this sooner. But if they're doing it now, better late than never, I guess. Somebody asked an interesting question. Jimmy at GG says, if the SEC becomes the only conference playing, does that bring West Coast players here in the future? It very well could. And it just goes back to what I said before. You know, people will self-select. People will choose what's best for them. If they see an SEC that's trying to lead the way in health and safety protocols and also lead the way towards having a season again, that will work for some players. It won't work for all of them. There's some players that kind of don't want that. There's some players that I think are a little bit happier with a different kind of arrangement between themselves, their school, and their conference. But for a lot of them, they will notice. The SEC was kind of already doing pretty well when it comes to West Coast recruiting anyway. But for a school like Oregon, that, for instance, kind of wants to be an SEC-style school within the Pac-12, harder for them to do that when they have to bear the burden of, a league that just seems to clearly want to go about things in a very different kind of way. Now, I guess the question you have to ask yourself is all of this just saber rattling? Would the SEC really move forward? Would the Big 12 and the ACC really move forward if the Pac-12 and the Big 10 didn't? I think that gets very interesting because if you're the three leagues that did play, let's just say that for the sake of conversation. It's been rumored that the ACC might play, rumored that the Big 12 might play, rumored that the SEC is trying everything it can to play. If you did do that and some bad negative health consequence happened, obviously that would be viewed as a disaster. It would just be viewed as a disaster, right? But consequently, on the other side of things, if those three leagues played, everything goes well. Because remember, there are plenty of people that were telling you couldn't have an NFL draft. That was a smashing success. The people that were wrong about that have never had to, atone for their error because that's not the way it works. But, we have seen naysayers. There were naysayers for the bubble. All of a sudden, the sports bubbles, the ones for the NBA and the MLS, are like the greatest idea ever. But the same people who say you can't do college football were also saying you couldn't do a bubble. So, the batting average for predictions for what will and won't work is not very good right now. So let's say that, the three leagues I just mentioned, SEC, ACC, Big 12, had a season that goes well. And the Big 10, the Pac-12 look awful by comparison. And it would hurt them with their donors, with their in-state politicians. It would hurt them in that regard. People would try to move away from that. Jay Shipe says, how about a 10-game G-Day play? You think about like The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary and stuff like that supposedly like the best basketball games ever played were like the scrimmages between the 1992 Olympic team against each other. It would be kind of interesting to see, the bad thing about G-Day is the players are never really trying all that hard because why would you? Can you imagine if you really did have, like true, like 92 Dream Team style Georgia scrimmages? Like you put Jamie Newman on one side, you put JT Daniels on another, you put Carson Beck on one team, Juan Mathis on another. So you got two quarterbacks on both sides. You start splitting running backs up. You could make two really good offensive lines with the group that Georgia has. There's certainly enough receivers to start splitting them up, although it's going to be a little too tricky to make it completely even, just given which team Pickens is on. Georgia plays about 30 defensive guys on regular snaps. You can absolutely split that group up and have 11 on both sides. If you really wanted to do like full-on real football scrimmages, not the kind of three-quarter speed stuff you see in a spring game, but like what I'm sure they do when they practice. If you really wanted to split that group up and make something entertaining, you could definitely do that. Dallas Schwartz says he lives in California. He says, sadly, the stupid is rampant out here. But if any SEC teams need a game, SC will gladly fill that spot, fight on. Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of USC folks that would love to schedule some of those games that were sad about losing their game with Alabama, and I'm sure they'd love. Remember this, Dallas. I've made the case that USC should be in the SEC. I've made the case that the next phase of SEC expansion should go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So I'd be glad to bring USC into this league. Nature Gator says that I got a little wound up when it comes to college football season. Yeah, listen, I'm not going to let this thing go down without a fight. And for those who are brave enough to fight for it, I'm going to support them. I am going to do that. He says the issue is complex like the virus itself. I hope science is the key decider on the matter, not politics and lawyers only. I think that's very well said. And I was talking to my buddy Connor Riley before the show began today that, I have political beliefs just like anybody else does. And there are politicians that I like. There are politicians that I don't. I would never tell you which ones are which because I've got too much respect for you to vomit out my political opinions to you on this show. However, the one thing I'm a firm believer in, the politicians I agree with, the politicians I don't agree with, I don't want any of them getting involved in the coronavirus conversation because we live in a time where no matter which side of the aisle you're on, and I'm thankful on a big show like this, we have red team people, blue team people, gray team people, everything in between that are kind of, a part of the show. I think that no matter which side you're on, you would agree that for the most part, America's too politicized and that making things more political has never made anything better. So by, the politicians are going to see the movement, the hashtag we want to play, things like that. And some of them are going to want to get involved with. And maybe others are going to want to push back on that because they feel like it's good politics to be against, sports at the moment. I think on both sides of the aisle, no matter which side you're on, the involvement of politicians on this makes it worse. And if you're a politician that wants to step up and make the case for, hey, well, this is what we need to have football, it's only going to embolden your political enemies to argue the other side even more. We just got to try to find a way to keep politics out of this. I know that's easier said than done. And we all have political beliefs. But I just think the more we can reject any insertion of politics into this, the better it's going to be. Maybe that's certainly better said than done. And, as far as letting the science, guide what's done here, it's also important to remember this, that take meteorologists, for instance. That's a field of science. When you print out like barometric readings and things like that, those barometric readings, those, weather data, that doesn't tell you if it's going to rain or not. The way a meteorologist determines if it's going to rain, and obviously you watch TV, they get it wrong sometimes, but it's always human interpretation of computerized data. That's the science of meteorology. Really, all science kind of works that way as well. That when you say, hey, the science is going to dictate what we do here, data doesn't tell you what to do. Data exists to be interpreted. That's an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to stuff like that. Janet Walker says there's a lot of testosterone in the chat today. Janet, we appreciate you being here to kind of smooth some of that out a bit. All right, a couple more. We got to get ready to go. Boy, it's already late. Bill McConnell says, have you heard anything about Bill Norton? It seems like he kind of disappeared. I think the problem for Georgia is when you've got such a deep roster that, you sign a big 4-star guy or whatever, he's part of the Tennessee 3, I believe that he was. And it is a little out of sight, out of mind in the early going because, my gosh, it's just hard to find a way to get on the field. But I don't think that in the case of guys like that, it should mean that he's somehow behind schedule. Things you hear some of the same kind of stuff about Clay Webb sometimes, who was higher rated recruit, but on the offensive side of the ball of, hey, why haven't we heard this guy yet? I think what's happening above these guys in the depth chart is usually the main reason why we haven't heard from them yet. And, you say, well, what about Trayvon Walker? He was playing a bunch as a freshman. Yeah, that's because he's Trayvon Walker. They just don't make freshmen like that very much. Frank Patterson says, who are your 4 teams to add to the SEC? I don't know that I'd have 4. But I guess all of mine, I guess in a dream scenario, I'd want to add the University of North Carolina because I think it's weird that the SEC doesn't have a North Carolina school. I think University of North Carolina would be a pretty good one to add, and that's a bigger fan base than you realize. That's a school that is pretty ACC tried and true, but could probably be baptized into the SEC a little quicker than you might realize. So I think UNC would be a good one to add. That gives you a state you're not currently in. I've jokingly said before, but I am halfway serious about this. USC's talked about going independent because, frankly, they just see the same snare in the Pac-12 the rest of us do. Send an invite out to those guys. If you could have, how many different Tigers do you have in the SEC? You got a gazillion Tigers. How many is it? 3? Yeah, you got 3 Tigers. If you can have 3 Tigers, and you can have 2 USCs, University of South Carolina, University of Southern California, you could if you're going to do that, you could easily do the other. Nature Gator says Jason Marshall committed to Florida. We talked about this, Nature. Come on now. We did this in the regular show. Don't act like we ducked that. We gave Florida credit for that. I also said I can't wait for Marshall's eventual top 5 because that's coming. Florida commits have a way of kind of doing that. But yeah, we gave the Gators some credit for Marshall. Bill McConnell says SEC, meaning it's supposed to be the Southeast. Bill, I'm right there with you. I liked the geographic nature of this league, but once you added Missouri and Texas A&M, you broke that anyway. This is not a geographic league anymore. Enrique Murillo says that I've been watching Tiger King. No, I haven't. I missed that. I'm not a big Netflix guy, but I know what it is. All right, we got to get ready to go. Let me do a couple more on Facebook. Get ready to go. Philip Jordan Wells continuing his tradition of slowly mocking the YouTube folks, saying, "What's a nature gator?" Robert Barnes says he thinks that 14 teams is enough for the SEC. Yeah, maybe so. I could see the next big move in college athletics to kick a few teams out. It's sort of like, I'm going to date myself with this reference. The band is older than I am, but it's like, after John Bonham died, when Led Zeppelin wanted to go back on tour, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant looked at, is it John Paul Jones at the name of the bass player, looked at him and said, we're going to make the same money if you tour with us or not. So they just kicked him out, and Page and Plant went on tour together. I could see the SEC one day looking at, Mississippi State and saying, Vanderbilt, well, I guess Vanderbilt's got the fancy pants academic, so maybe they'll save them. But looking at some of these schools and saying, hey, we'd make the same money if you were here or not, so we're going to kick you out. Joel Moody says, when am I going to have a call-in show? I wanted to do a call-in show. Some of the Facebook people said they didn't want one. I still want to do that. We have the technology to take the phone calls like a radio show would. The Facebook people said they just wanted to read the comment. So I'm in favor of doing that. Drew Odom will make this the last comment. Says, I'm coming in late. Any word on the players developing a union? There was obviously the chatter last night as the hashtag We Are United and the hashtag We Want to Play folks seem to come together. And there's going to be a big wrestling match to try to define what all of this means. People like me have an agenda. We're going to try to define it a certain way. Other folks who, have been pushing a lot of this are going to try to define it a different way. I think the one thing that you should always assume with all of this is the hashtag We Are United aren't quite as united as you might think. And the hashtag We Want to Play, the only true idea that unites them is the fact that they want to play. That there's going to be an attempt to try to define this movement as some sort of truly organized endeavor. And for the most part, that's just not kind of the way these things typically work. There will be attempts for people outside college football to try to step in and have power over this, but the players should be aware that if that's what happens, all you've done is trade one boss for the other. You've traded a coach who has a financial incentive to have your best interest in mind for a sort of a shadowy figure that may or may not have your best interest in mind. I would be very careful about that if I were you. So we're going to watch this take place. We're going to see how this goes, but the fantasy of some sort of great unity between these players will ultimately probably prove to be just that, something that's not quite as bound together as the most tried and true believers on the internet maybe kind of want to make it be. Robert Reynolds says if we had a call-in show, we could hear Matt Rukavina calling him from a different spot every single day. That's probably true. All right, we got to get ready to go. Make sure you check out the AJC for your Atlanta news now. Obviously, one of the issues driving all of this in sports is, how high schools, things like that are responding to the coronavirus. You may have seen the issue in Paulding County. There's some more information about that, some positive tests coming from local high school there. So follow that online, Atlanta News Now at ajc.com. Reaction to the PGA Championship yesterday. Boy, what an unbelievable event that was. Colin Morikawa a part of this very young group of new golfers. Y'all know I love the PGA Tour. Loved the event this week. I thought the golf was great. I thought the course was a little too easy yesterday. Kind of, well, it made for high scores in terms of what you kind of hope you get from Bay Area golf. May not quite have gotten that yesterday, but really good stuff. And the Atlanta Falcons, what else is new? They have a huge salary cap issue awaiting them as you move towards 2021. You can follow that with our boy D-Led and everything else. It is Atlanta News Now, AJC.com. Make sure you follow all of that. We appreciate you being here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric, and trust R.S. Andrews to do all of that for you. If your water heater goes out in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day, but you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You have a great day. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.